I'm going to introduce our extinguished speaker. And when we started talking about prostitution, we could think of no one with better qualifications to talk about it than Karen Richards.
I'm not sure what that means.
Years of experience in the field as a law enforcement
Thank you.
officer.
All right, good, Mike.
Have brought her into contact with a history of how law was enforced in early years in Fort Wayne. She is a graduate of Indiana and Northwestern universities and is the current Allen County prosecutor. So please welcome Karen Richards,
Thank
a
you.
member of Archer's Board.
Thank you. I am like completely overwhelmed by the number of people that showed up. You know, when this all started, Lori had a space on the free lectures, and I, of course, foolishly said, sure, I'll do one. And then I started to do the research on this and found out that there really is not a whole lot written about this topic. About the only research in Fort Wayne that's ever been done on this particular subject matter was done by John Beatty, who works here at the library. He did a really interesting article, but other than that, I really couldn't find very much. So I want to thank John for starting this whole thing out, but I also want to thank Lori for helping me find some things that I wasn't able to find on my own, and also Walter Font from the History Center. Walter is a wonderful man, and there were several things I was interested in looking at to put this together that he found for me. One of them were the original city court dockets from the 1890s. So I read all of them for 1895, 1896, and 1897, and they were fascinating. The other thing that Walter found for me was a book written in 1886 by a guy we'll discuss by the name of Mason Long, who began as a gambler and ended up being finding God and ended up being an evangelist and wrote a wonderful book called Save the Girls about why women became prostitutes in this period of time, what was wrong with society that put them there, and some of the things that he thought could help. And then the other thing Walter found for me, which is towards the end of the lecture, which I found the absolute most fascinating, is one of Fort Wayne's leading families donated some information on one of their early relatives. And they donated what must have been, you know when you go to a funeral, you sign the little book? Well, that book with the obituaries, and apparently what people did then was they sent telegrams, and all of the telegrams that came in for her funeral. And that information ended up being really interesting because what they said about her in the obituary, in juxtaposition with what I found out about what she did for a living, was one of the funniest things I've come across in a long time. So I wanted to thank all those folks for helping me out. And you know you're getting old when you can't do a PowerPoint without readers. Anyway, I tried really hard to find a picture of one of Fort Wayne's lovely lasses and could find absolutely none. So instead, I pulled a couple from a really fascinating article written about Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And I happen to be from the Illinois-Wisconsin border, so I'm pretty familiar with Eau Claire. And what's interesting about Eau Claire is it's a little bit smaller than Fort Wayne, but it has some parallels in history. What drove Eau Claire was their lumber industry versus what drove Fort Wayne was our transportation industry. So this is a lovely photo of one of, I think, Kansas City's finest. And this is a photograph of another couple of lovely ladies. What sets these women out as prostitutes are a couple of things. Number one, this is their night apparel. These are not day clothes. It was completely inappropriate to ever show your legs, and those are their stockinged legs. What you may not be able to see on the table is a big old bottle of beer, and next to that is a set of playing cards. Women were never allowed in a parlor where cards were being played. So just so you get an idea of what these ladies looked like, there's a couple of photos for you. What I found the most fascinating, I think, as I was putting this lecture together, as you follow the lecture of vice and prostitution in Fort Wayne, what you're really looking at is a reflection of all sorts of things. You learn all kinds of things about the growth of transportation and industry in Fort Wayne. you get a really fascinating look at what people's social mores and views of sexuality were back then. I mean, they are so, for folks who don't take history, the differences in how we view things are just incredible. Women's rights, or complete lack of any, almost the entire period of time that I'm speaking about, women did not have the right to vote. There's a lot of underlying racial issues in how this city viewed prostitution, and there's also some really interesting ethnic prejudices. I think if you study history, the latest group that ever emigrates to this country is always the worst. And I think the interesting thing is you never, or very seldom do you ever hear in the history of prostitution in Fort Wayne about the issue of white slavery until people of darker skin start running brothels. And lastly, it's a really interesting study of law enforcement, because basically crime and vice is what drew Fort Wayne to start their first police force, their first court system, and their first jail. So what begins all of this out? And before I go any farther, I think what I tried to do with this is, I think what's wrong with history in public schools, and I apologize if there's great teachers in here, but what's wrong with history and why nobody takes it is nobody tries to make it fun or interesting or quirky or anything else. So the whole purpose of this lecture is to try to make history a little bit more fun and to give you a little bit different view of how Fort Wayne came to be what it is. So let's start out with the Wabash and Erie Canal. For those of you who don't know, and I only know this because my office is there, if you go downtown, there's that elevated set of railroad tracks, runs right past my office. It runs basically behind the landing, you know the one I mean. That railroad track is actually built on the filled-in bed of the Wabash and Erie Canal. So if you're trying to get your places, that's where the canal was. Construction on the canal began in 1830. And when construction began, it brought two very different populations of people to Fort Wayne with really, really different views of society. And I think the other thing that's interesting is it brought just tons of single male construction workers to this city. So in 1830, when the canal began, the U.S. Census says that if you take a view of the population of men 20 to 50 and women 20 to 50, there were 331 men to 190 women. So you can begin to see what the issues are going to be. Now, the first set of folks that arrived were people from New England. They were from the New England states and New York. And they were mostly families who arrived with children, husband, wife, children, to take advantage of a lot of the commercial opportunities that came to Fort Wayne because of the building of the canal. They had a very puritanical view of the relationships between men and women and the roles of men and women in society. The other set of folks that came were very different, and they were mostly canal workers. They were young single men, mostly from Irish and German backgrounds. Almost all of them came just by themselves, no children, no wives. They came from a culture, obviously they're German and Irish, they came from a culture where drinking is okay. Puritans come from a culture where people don't drink. Very few single women came with them, so hey, if you're a guy, you're in Fort Wayne, you got no TV, there's nothing to do, and there are no women. What are you gonna do? So, you can see where this is going. What I found really fascinating, and I guess I knew this, but I had to be told all over again, is puritanical and Victorian views of women and men and sexuality and how they related to each other are incredibly different from what ours are now. It became really clear in all the newspaper articles and things that I read is sex is only if you're married. And the only purpose of sex in marriage is for procreation. It was completely inappropriate to have an extramarital relationship or a premarital relationship. Women were supposed to remain pure, and you were never supposed to burden your wife with sex that didn't have as its purpose procreation. how different things are today. And, you know, it was pretty clear that they began to call any woman that had sex outside of a married relationship a prostitute, whether money exchanged hands or not. So what men ended up doing is they would end up having private relationships with prostitutes, and it was okay as long as these kinds of things were done privately. And what would happen is a lot of the men would do them under an assumed name, so that if they were arrested, their name would not be linked to their real name and no one would find out. So now that we've seen pictures of these lovely lasses, who were these ladies? There was absolutely nothing I could find in Fort Wayne in any of the history that told me what these women would have been like. So I went to the article on Eau Claire, and it gave also a kind of across the country historical perspective, and this is what it tells. In the early time, most of these women were native born. They were either of Irish or German descent, a lot like the canal workers. The average age of a prostitute in the United States was between 17 and 21 years old, although unfortunately I found a lot of records of girls as young as 14 being prostitutes in this town. They could be single or they could be married, and many of them had children, which I found really disturbing. There was a lot of anecdotal stories about men who traveled for a living who basically just would leave, and they'd leave their wives and kids here at home with absolutely no means of support. So what these married women with kids were doing is they were taken to prostitution just to pay the bills while their husbands were gone. There were a lot of instances of of wives and husbands running brothels together. The man would run the business, she would run the business, but she was also taking money, and at the time he was getting arrested for running a house of ill repute, she was getting arrested for prostitution. It must have made a very interesting marital relationship. In the beginning, most of the women in prostitution came from farms, which was because we were basically an agricultural society. Later in the 1800s, a lot of these women, especially in the big cities, were immigrants. These women stayed in business an average of 5 to 6 years for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is a really nasty, awful business. Romanticizing this is not completely inappropriate, but pretty inappropriate, because for most of these women, this was not a nice lifestyle. And a lot of these women died after 5 or 6 years. They used pseudonyms a lot so that they could either move from town to town and their arrest records wouldn't follow them, or they would use a pseudonym because they could be prostitutes here under a pseudonym and move to another town under their real name, reinvent themselves, and maybe actually try to get married and do something legitimate with their lives. When we're talking about pseudonyms, the first arrest for a prostitute that I could find was for a woman by the name of Elizabeth Lamoureux, which is a French word that means amorous lover. So that was her pseudonym. Now, the part that I think I found really interesting is why these women did what they did. You know, the first one I think is somewhat, but not totally self-explanatory. Women became prostitutes because there really were not a lot of occupational opportunities for women in the 1800s. You could be things like a seamstress or a laundress, or work cleaning people's houses, work in as a house servant, maybe be a teacher if you had some education. But mostly women were not educated, and there just weren't a lot of opportunities. The man that I mentioned, Mason Long, when he wrote this book in 1886 called Save the Girls, this was his quote, and I really think this was true. They become courtesans because in youth, under our present social system, they are not taught any useful trade or occupation. And that was really true. A lot of these women came from very abusive homes or relationships. And I'll kind of give you some insight into that, but there was a lot of alcohol abuse, there was a lot of physical abuse in marriages, and a lot of women were abused. And so they would escape either their family home or their husbands and become prostitutes because at least they would get away from the abuse. Money was clearly important. And again, I go back to this article from Eau Claire, Wisconsin. They did a wage survey in 1913. In Wisconsin in 1913, the living wage was considered to be $9 a week. The wage for a woman was $3 to $6 a week, but the wage for a prostitute was $15 to $40 a week. And it seemed, from everything I could tell, the basic cost of a trick in the 1800s was between $1 and $2 a piece, if that gives you kind of an overview of things. So, fallen women is in parentheses because, honest to God, that is what they called women back then who had relationships outside of marriage. And, you know, I don't think we're the first people that invented having sex before marriage. I mean, people did it in the 1800s too. The problem was that if you had sex with somebody who didn't marry you, you were ruined for the rest of your life and no one else would have you. So a lot of these women get jilted by their lovers. They can't enter into marriage because in a town the size of Fort Wayne, everybody's going to know what you did. And so you end up being a prostitute as pretty much the only way you have to survive. The quote again from Mason Long's book is, these women had 3 choices: suicide, starvation, or open shame. And most of them picked open shame. I did read a lot of stories about women that did have legitimate jobs, and my grandmother actually told me that she got harassed a lot. She was my grandmother was born in 1879. She was a beautiful little Swedish girl, and she worked in the house of some rich people in St. Paul. And she, I don't know why she ever told me this, but she had a very difficult time because both the husband and the older son would not leave her alone. So, you know, a lot of women figure if they're going to get harassed on their legitimate jobs, they might as well have sex with somebody for money. A lot of women are enticed as new immigrants, especially in the larger cities. I don't know if you ever read Devil in the White City by Eric Larson, but a lot of his victims were new immigrant girls. But a lot of these young women are coming right off the boat or right off a train, and I've got a little picture of this later. They're met by men that say, hey, you know, I got a great deal for you. I'm going to give you a place to live. I'm going to give you a job, and you're going to be great. And by the time they get to the brothel, the first thing that happens is they get raped. The next thing that happens is they're working as prostitutes. A lot of feeble-minded women, because there was no place for these folks to go and no help for them, so a lot of developmentally disabled, and I'm using terms they used back then. Feeble-minded was their term. And there's no safety net for women, absolutely none. So especially after the Civil War, you're seeing a lot of women whose husbands get killed in the war, and they have no way to support themselves. They have no way to support themselves or their families. And there are also a lot of landlords that just were not very ethical. There was a place in Fort Wayne called Hickman's Summit City House, run by a guy by the name of Hickman. And he was arrested at one point because he would encourage women with children to live in his house, and then as soon as they couldn't pay the rent, he became their pimp and they became prostitutes, or he threatened to throw them out on the street. Just to give you a little visual, this is Mason Long. What was life like for these ladies? Really honest, I think there was a reason. They were probably only in business for about 5 years. As they say in Eau Claire, brothels are frequented by the most desperate and dangerous characters who infest the valley. And I think that's true of prostitution every place. You know, these were people armed with guns, armed with knives. These were common criminals. These were not nice guys. Venereal disease was a huge problem. For those of you who don't remember your history, I think Al Capone died of syphilis. Penicillin was really not readily available as a cure for venereal disease until about the 1940s. Abortions and unwanted pregnancies were pretty common. For those of you who didn't take women's rights in college like I did, you know, birth control was illegal in this country. It wasn't until there were a couple of court rulings in the 1920s that it was legal for a doctor to prescribe birth control in this country. And it wasn't until about then that the product rubber got to the point where you could actually make condoms out of it. So until about the 1920s, there was no acceptable, available method of birth control in this country, basically in any other. Drugs and alcohol were incredibly prevalent, and a lot of women became alcoholics or drug addicts and died as a result of those two. And there are numerous stories in the newspaper about women being found dead in the street of either voluntary or involuntary drug overdoses or the effect of long-term alcoholism. There's a lot of physical danger, and I put in here from the public, from clients, and from each other. There's a great little article that Walter Font found for me from September 12th, 1986, and the title of it is Pugilistic Prostitutes. And it's this great little newspaper article about these two drunken hookers who are caught in the middle of a downtown street decking each other out in broad daylight. And that, of course, made the news. Their names were Molly Smedley and Molly Smith. And, you know, one of the things the public tended to do to brothels when they didn't want them there is they tended to burn them down. And there's a great story from Fort Wayne that, again, I think gets into the whole racial issue. And you got to remember, during the Civil War, this town was not necessarily pro-North, and it was definitely not abolitionist. There were a lot of really heavy Southern tendencies in this town. There was a brothel, and I'll read you the little article. There was a brothel in downtown Fort Wayne where Toscani's stands now. It was the only African-American brothel in town. A lot of the information that I got from the newspapers and that John Beatty got also were because through the history of the 1800s, there was an editor by the name of John Dawson. This guy is a hoot. I mean, his objective journalism did not exist in John Dawson's vocabulary, trust me. And one of the things he loved to write about was police corruption, vice, and all this kind of stuff. So this is, I read this newspaper article, and it was a hoot. This is from April 23rd, 1860, and it's written by John Dawson. On Monday next, we shall expose, and this is a direct quote, expose the Negro doings of a crowd who live in a house on Wayne Street, 1 square west of Calhoun, unless the people drive the inmates out before that time. Now, I will tell you that inmates was the common term for a prostitute that lived in a brothel. There are two possible endings to this story. We give the same story on Arch's History Walk, and I will tell you that I cannot find anywhere where we got the information I'm about ready to give you, but the information that we got is that shortly after this article came out, and I think in large part because these women were African American, the public actually tore this house down board by board and drove these women out of town. What I found really interesting was that 2 days later, this article came out, April 23rd, 1860 was a Saturday. On Monday, the following advertisement came out in the same newspaper. There is a $300 reward for arson for anyone who can turn in the arsonist who is responsible for buildings destroyed in Fort Wayne. I am thinking that what may very well have happened was John Dawson's call to arms resulted in that brothel being burned to the ground. So, things were very interesting. There was also not a lot of sympathy for these ladies from anyone, including the police, the courts, or the respectable public. So, what did we call these places and what did they look like? I found this stuff kind of fascinating. The first thing that brothels or whatever were called was a hotel of assignation. And what that basically meant is you've got a hotel with lots of small rooms that are rented for very short periods of time. For those of us in law enforcement, it's a lot like all the seedy hotels that are around the Fort Myers truck stop on US 30. It's the same thing, folks. A brothel a lot of times is a place where these women would not only prostitute, but they would actually live. Saloons tended to have what they called stalls, which by the description I got must have been about the size of a horse stall. And what would happen is women would find men in the saloon and drag them off to these little stalls and have sex with them for money. Dance halls would have either had rooms above the dance hall or the same concept. Now, a parlor house is a little different. A parlor house is a legitimate business on the first floor, but the second floor divided into parlor rooms where women would be prostitutes. And you can tell that that happened a lot in Fort Wayne because when you go to the arrest records from city court, you will find that the arrest taking place on the upper floor of, and then it will give a street address. And one of the favorites seemed to be Conway's Saloon on East Main Street, seemed to have a lot of arrests. What would take place on the first floor would be things like a saloon, a theater, a dance hall, or a pool hall. Hickman's Summit City House on East Columbia was the place where he would pimp his female tenants if they couldn't pay their rent. There were a lot of places near the canal. And in fact, some of the stuff I read said women sometimes didn't even bother to take men to buildings. A lot of the banks of the canal apparently were pretty darn busy places. There also started to be a lot of prostitution on the west end of the canal. And as Fort Wayne grew, one of the first directions that it grew was west. In fact, the first nice hotel outside of the summits, or outside of the central part of the city, stood where St. Joe Hospital stands now, and the name of it is escaping me. I'm sorry, and I know this, I can't remember it. But anyway, so a lot of brothels grew up on the west end of the canal in West Central, right in that Broadway Main Street area. And the last place that we're starting to get brothels is outside the city limits. If any of you take the ghost tour, there used to be a little creek that ran through downtown called Bloody Run, and I won't ruin the ghost story part of it, but that creek actually originated way outside of town, and what was considered outside of town was the area about where Taylor and Broadway intersect today. And I found an old city directory that listed the Bloody Run House. Must have been a saloon with a brothel contingent, because the city directory will list people's names and then their occupations. The women that were listed as living at that house, and the house was run by a Mary Molly Dunbar. The women listed at that house listed their occupation as ladies of pleasure. And the newspaper again took great affront to this place. And after a long diatribe by John Dawson, who used some very interesting, colorful language, the city drove these women out and the place was closed. Now, this little booger comes from a really fun book, if you have never read it, called Sin in the Second City. It was written by Karen Abbott, and I stole this from her book, I admit it. I'm giving her credit, however. She wrote a really fascinating book about probably the most palatial brothel, probably in the country. It was a place called the Everly House, and it was run by two Everly sisters. The place was just incredible. What we had was nothing like this. But this again goes to that whole concept of fallen women. I mean, it was thought that dance halls and alcohol enticed women into this lifestyle, which then led them to have sex outside of marriage, which then led them into prostitution, which seems really far-fetched today. However, in this time period, actually, it was pretty darn close to the truth. Just to give you an idea of how dangerous brothels could be, and I didn't include pictures because I knew I was going to run out of time, but this brothel in Chicago, which was incredibly palatial, gilded walls and the whole 9 yards, I'm from outside of Chicago, so anyway, everybody knows Marshall Field's department store, also the same family that gave money and started the Field Museum in Chicago. Anyway, the direct heir of the Marshall Field fortune was Marshall Field Jr. Well, one day Marshall Field Jr.'s servants or wife came to find him pretty much next to dead in the little parlor off his bedroom in their palatial mansion, blood all over the place, a gun at his feet, and a long trail of blood through the hallway. Well, what they sold that as is Marshall Field Jr. cleaning his gun and shooting himself by accident. What really happened was he got into a little tiff with a hooker at the Everly house, and she shot him. And they were so afraid that the place was going to get closed down because Marshall Field Jr. got shot in their brothel that they dragged him back to his house, put his gun at his feet, and left him there. So anyway, if you want to read that book, it's a lot of fun. It was a good time. Honest, this is true. The Chicago Times in 1871, and this is a direct quote, said, "Fort Wayne by record is the most lawless town in Indiana. The general existing impunity of crime in the city has encouraged its outbreak." So, what's a town to do? Well, they decided that maybe they ought to have a court, so they get one. The population in Fort Wayne by 1860, according to the U.S. Census, was 10,388 people. However, by 1860, there were so many cases of intoxication, gambling, and prostitution that they needed a court to actually deal with all of this. So they formed what was called the mayor's court. I found this fascinating. So whoever the mayor was, these people would parade in front of him, and he would sit at his desk and listen to all this and then find them guilty or not guilty and mete out fines and occasionally jail time. I swear to God, this is true. And none of these guys, or at least most of them, were lawyers. These were just mayors, and they had mayor's court. So, what led to mayor's court? Well, in the 1860s, for a population of 10,388, there were 180 whiskey and beer shops in Fort Wayne. I mean, come on, we had no TV. You got to do something, right? And the fines reveal to me, as I was reading both the city court and city court followed mayor's court, when I was reading the book, it really tells us a lot about how society views women. And so I'm just going to give you one little example. I read the book for April 25th, 1895. The guy's name is irrelevant, and I don't even remember what it was, but on one line, on this particular date, a man is arrested. The crime is intoxication and beating his wife, okay? On the line directly below it, some guy is arrested for associating with a prostitute, and the line directly under that is there's an arrest for prostitution. You go to the next little column and it gives the fine. If you beat your wife, you get fined $10.50. If you associate with a prostitute, you get fined $20, and if you're a prostitute, you get fined $20. So you can beat your wife for half the cost. And to me, that ought to say something to everybody about how women were viewed in this society. When you start getting into the subtle concepts of how prostitutes are referred to, they either refer to them as inmates, and I couldn't figure out the last one, or they referred to them as Cyprians, which made no sense to me till I started to do some research on what that word meant. So this is how they get to where they were going. And this again is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about as new ethnic and racial groups move into Fort Wayne, they become the bad guys. All right, a Cyprian is somebody who is from Cyprus, right? If you go back to your ancient history, I believe Aphrodite either came from or had an oracle or something on Cyprus. Aphrodite was the goddess of love. So what a Cyprian came to be known in this time was a person with wanton or lustful tendencies. So I don't see any English folks having their names associated with prostitutes, but you're clearly starting, and I'm saying this for a reason, you're clearly starting to see darker skinned, more Southern European folks referred to as far as prostitution goes in a negative way. and adultery. And I don't know if I can explain this so it makes sense, but the interesting thing is it was illegal to have sex outside of marriage. It was illegal for both the man and the woman. And it was illegal to live with somebody in a relationship who wasn't your spouse. So I'm looking through these records and I find this man and woman, different last names, arrested for adultery. Well, most of the prostitution arrests are because the police officers are either going to the location to do kind of a raid or something like that. So you see them pulled into court right when they're doing the act. The interesting thing about this adultery thing is they must have done an investigation on these poor people because the mayor issued a warrant for their arrest, and they were both brought in on a warrant, which I found to be a really interesting thing. The other thing that was interesting about the fines for prostitutes is your fine or your case could be dismissed. And it used to happen when I first came to town. This is what we used to do. Your fine or your case would be dismissed if you promised you would leave town. So in a lot of the judgment books, you will see it dismissed or no fine, and next to it said left town. Okay, I want to give you an idea of what's going on. This is from 1895. So, you can see your top crimes. In 1895, I don't have an exact population statistic for Fort Wayne, but the U.S. Census tells us that in 1890, the population was 35,000. In 1900, the population was 45,000. So I'm just going to use the middle, which is 40,000, okay? Right now, we have a population of about 320,000. So if my math is right, that's 8 times what they had back then, right? Okay. So go to the very first crime, intoxication. They had 458 cases of intoxication for a population of about 40,000. Well, today, with a population of 320,000, we only have about 1,000 arrests for that. So if our population is 8 times what it was back then, if our rate for drinking would be the same, we'd be arresting, what, 7,000 people for intoxication if they were arrested at the same rate they were back then. And you can go down and kind of see the same thing. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is those are the men that are hiring the prostitutes. That's associating with prostitutes, and the next one is prostitution. So I thought that was very interesting. If you go down, I'll give you a second. I find these just hilarious. One of my favorites is wait, where's fast driving? Fast driving. Okay, you guys, they got horses. Come on. Selling lottery tickets. Wait, where's my next favorite? It might be on the next slide. Yeah, Sabbath desecration. I think that's if you're drinking, partying, or in a saloon on the Sabbath. Okay, it must be on the next one. Where is keeping chickens too close to your house? Wait, I swear this is true. It's right here. Honest, history is fun. It should be anyway. So, really, and I want you to look at that for a second because I didn't bring the 1897 statistics. I found the 1897 statistics absolutely bizarre. Because if you go all the way down, this cruelty to animals, I'm figuring you're beating the livery stable's horse, because a lot of people didn't own their own. They rented them from a livery stable. And you're not going to get in trouble back then for a dog, a chicken, or anything. It must have been a horse was the only thing I could figure out. Exposing indecent pictures. You could get arrested for being feeble-minded. Where are you? Oh, surety of the peace? I have no clue. I think it's probably like disorderly conduct. Okay, I want to jump all the way down here. Jumping on freight train. Honest, this is true. I did not, and I'm trying not to run out of time, I did not have time to include this, but 2 years after these stats came out, the most arrested crime in the city of Fort Wayne was jumping on a moving train. And which is what I'm getting to. I think the railroad was obviously here, and I think there were so many vagrants and vagabonds coming to Fort Wayne and causing trouble that they were trying to get rid of the hobos. Anyway, the next thing that happens that affects prostitution is the Civil War. And for those of you who know where Camp Allen Drive, if you go down Main Street and you go, is that the Carroll Lombard Bridge? Is that it? Okay. If you go over the Carroll Lombard Bridge and you're going into the Nebraska neighborhood, right off to your left is Camp Allen Drive. Camp Allen Drive is named that because at the beginning of the Civil War, Camp Allen provided a location for the recruit of local regiments for the Civil War. You can tell where I'm going with this. The canal was also right there, even though I don't believe it was used that much at that point. But anyway, that's where Camp Allen is. And Dawson, the newspaper editor, predicts that the decision to bring undisciplined soldiers to the city is a calamity of increased crime. Whoa, boy, was he right. So you got all these guys, they're all young, they're mostly unmarried, you're bringing them to Camp Allen to recruit them for the Civil War, and there they sit until you send them someplace. So what do you think they did? Yes, they did. They're drinking, they're gambling, they're causing trouble, and they're visiting a whole lot of brothels. So, and there was really absolutely no discipline. So I pulled this quote because I think it's just funnier than heck. In 1863, the city council created a special commission on nuisances. And they issued a statement about prostitution basically saying that they're finding the city infested with a class of women, and it is the opinion of your commission that by proper vigilance on the part of our city officers, it can be abated. We therefore would recommend to this board that some active measures in regard to this matter be taken. It is the opinion of your commission a nuisance which is calculated to injure the morale of our city and should be removed. We also report that there is a class of men which accompany these women both night and day and should be arrested and confined in prison wherever found lounging in the city. So, this is one of my favorites. I found this guy fascinating. Anyway, Franklin P. Randall is our Civil War mayor. A term of mayor back in this period of time was 2 years. Franklin Randall did 5 years. He put together the city's first regularly organized police force for the express purpose of dealing with vice, gambling, intoxication, and prostitution. They hired 4 men. The captain was a guy by the name of Conrad Penz, who used to be a German sailor, and he had 3 patrolmen that worked with him, and they would patrol the city only from twilight to daybreak. And the whole purpose of this was to make it safe for citizens to walk the streets after dark, because it was getting just a little crazy out there. So, along with a police officer, you've got to have a police station. So this then led to the city's first police station, which was on Court Street. There were iron cages for the men, and I think, although I am not sure, that the History Center has one of these. They're like portable iron cages. I believe that's what they're talking about. But then there were rooms on the 2nd floor for the ladies. And just so you know what Franklin P. Randall looks like, there is a photograph of him at or about the time that he was mayor. In April, Arch's wonderful lecture is going to be on things that used to be in Fort Wayne, mostly buildings and beautiful places that we've lost. So I could not help but pique your interest with the Randall Mansion. This place was absolutely incredible. There is a whole collection of the Randall family photographs that were donated to the public library, which is where this came from. This place was incredible. It had a glass greenhouse. They'd take, at certain periods of time, palm trees out of the greenhouse and line the yard with them. People came from all over the country and would stay with the mayor in this lovely house, which was torn down from one of the most god-ugly, ugly buildings I have ever seen in my life, and that is the GTE building that stands kitty corner from Arch at the corner of Lafayette and Barry. And they took this absolutely to die for mansion down for that ugly piece of junk. Sorry, GTE. Personal opinion only. So, that should pique your interest on coming to the April lecture. So, the next thing that happens, and this is why I say prostitution is kind of a history of Fort Wayne, because as goes the transportation and commercial business in Fort Wayne, so goes the history of prostitution. And the next thing that starts to happen is we're getting a lot of railroad business. And it really does fuel the growth and the locations of where prostitution is occurring. The Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railroad has been in town, but what they do is they build a series of railroad shops and a roundhouse in East Central. And as best I can tell, they sat approximately where the post office is now. And there used to be a nice historical sign up, but somehow it disappeared, because I looked for it the other day to write down exactly what it said, and I couldn't find it. Either that or I'm blind. Anyway, so when they do this, hundreds of single men who are railroad workers come to Fort Wayne in order to build and repair rail cars. So, along with them, you get all the tramps, the drunks, and the gamblers that come on the trains, which is why I'm wondering if by 1897 that isn't why jumping on a moving train was the biggest offense you could get arrested for. So all these saloons and brothels start to spring up on Clinton and Calhoun, kind of even with the post office. In fact, Mason Long, whose picture I showed you before, that's where his saloon was. And you've already seen the crime stats that I've shown you, so you know what I'm talking about. The other thing that fueled the railroads, just so that you would know, is the Bass Foundry. And if you're wondering why the Bass name sounds familiar, that's the Bass Mansion where St. Francis is now located. But the fact that we had that foundry, I think, also led to the railroad coming here. So, if you got a police force, yep, sooner or later you're going to have police corruptions, and boy did they ever. I mean, this stuff is hilarious. What they were doing is they'd put a bail together for these people, and then they'd tell them not to show up because the city council got half of the forfeited bail. And then they'd go to court, and the fine, of course the city's represented by the city attorney, right? They were dividing the fines half between the court, which is where it's supposed to go. The city attorney got the other half. The newspaper at that time was the Gazette, and their quote is, "The city is cursed by a worthless police force." You know, it was pretty bad. They aren't basically arresting anybody. The police are in the brothels probably as much as everybody else is. And every time the city council orders a raid on a brothel, they get there and the darn thing's empty. Huh, wonder why? Because the police were all on the take. And it got to the point where things were getting so crazy that decent women, honest, were not safe on the streets. They were getting regular women, married women with kids, were getting accosted in broad daylight. And I love this story. This is from the 1870s. They had a police force. One of their officers was an Officer Murphy. And apparently he was pretty much a drunken mess. So he's out on the beat one day, drunk like crazy, and he sees this lady pull up in a carriage in front of a house at 109 Bar Street. So he comes to the conclusion, I don't know why, that it's a brothel. So he walks up to the front door, knocks the front door open, goes in and demands all the prostitution money from the two women inside. Well, the only problem is, this is not a brothel. This is some nice married woman by the name of Mrs. Kaag and her married sister who came to visit her. And because she doesn't give him any money, he ends up beating her and gets arrested and ends up going to prison. But this is the quality of law enforcement at that particular time. I've already told you about the African-American brothel that gets lit on fire, but at or about the same time, you're starting to get a criminal gang element. So, you know, don't think we're the first ones that have this, because we weren't. And our kind of mob criminal gang, whatever you want to call it, was run by a guy by the name of Edward Ryan. And Edward Ryan had organized, there was a lot of pickpockets back then, especially with the railroad. So he's organizing the gambling, the pickpockets, and the prostitutes. Well, unfortunately for him, one of his guys robs some man at the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago train depot. Well, the train workers kind of take offense at this, and when Ryan and some of his guys are arrested, 1,000 people show up at wherever they're having the court hearing just to make sure that the right thing takes place. Well, while they're all at the hearing, someone sets fire to Ed Ryan's saloon near the corner of, again, Clinton and Calhoun, because he's catering to the railroad guys. And the fire department shows up, and they decide they're just going to let the place burn to the ground, so it does. And at that point then, Edward Ryan's got nowhere to go, so he leaves town. So that's the end of the Edward Ryan gang. At or about the same time, women are starting to do some interesting things. And remember, women do not yet have the right to vote. So along with the beginnings of the suffrage movement among women is also the beginning of this movement that maybe we all ought to take care of each other. And women begin to think that maybe they ought to take care of people who are less fortunate. You're probably more familiar with Jane Addams, who actually grew up about 10 miles away from where I'm from, actually. My girlfriend, when I was a kid, lived in the house that she grew up in, so I've been in Jane Addams' house many times. But anyway, Jane Addams forms Hull House in Chicago. But here, in July of 1873, the Society for the Home of the Friendless is organized. And it's organized basically by the who's who of prominent women in Fort Wayne. One of them is Beulah, and I always mispronounce her name. I say Nind, I don't know if that's correct or not. But anyway, she comes from a family of abolitionists. So there's a long line of these women. But anyway, what they're doing is they're taking in either unwed mothers, prostitutes who want to get out of the business, and they buy a house. And this place stays in business for about 20 years. Before Mason Long finds God, he does something incredibly shocking during this period of time. I mean, you never think about this stuff. He introduces what they called back then waiter girls, which I'm sure are what we refer to as bar waitresses. I mean, women are not supposed to be in saloons. They're not supposed to be in bars. So when he's bringing these cute young things in to serve drinks as waiter girls in his saloon, life is not good and women take offense. He eventually figures this out, reforms himself, and then writes the book that I've referred to, which was written in 1886, called Save the Girls. And he, you know, for a guy that used to be a gambler, he must know a lot about how women got to be prostitutes, because he's really pretty right on the money. He talks about women being wronged by men, being disowned by their families, and calls for society to change their views on the plight of women. And he makes the interesting thing, he goes from kind of being a con artist in the saloon business to lecturing the country as an evangelist. And this is the period of time when we begin to see, instead of just independent brothels, we begin to see prostitution being almost designated in certain particular areas of Fort Wayne, and they're called red light districts, and some of them actually had red lights. There's one district, East Columbia, Calhoun, and Pearl Street. And when I say East Columbia, the building that we're in, you know where the landing dead ends into Calhoun? Well, the landing is Columbia Street, but it didn't always dead end into Calhoun. It continued all the way to the river. So it ran behind what's now the City County building, the Performing Arts, you know where I'm talking about? Became Fryman Square. That East Columbia is, during all of this period of time, is one of the largest red light districts. The second one is St. Mary's Flats on Eureka Street, and that, I don't know why everything is close to where I work, but if you take Calhoun and you're taking it north, actually, you're taking it north and you're going towards the jail, all right, you know where the jail is, and you know how Calhoun dead ends right there? If you would keep on going, take Calhoun until it dead ends into the St. Mary's River, that's where the St. Mary's Flats was. And then the other place, and some of these streets don't even exist anymore. Eureka Street's gone, so Chicago Street. Chicago and Baker Street near the railroads. So these are all becoming red light districts. The most notorious of all of these, and the seediest, is the St. Mary's Flats area. There's a couple stories about women hanging out the windows, shouting services and prices at passers-by. So it was kind of an interesting place. The good thing about organized red light districts is it takes women off the street and it takes them away from being street walkers. which is an incredibly dangerous way to be a prostitute. And instead, and again they refer to them as inmates, it offers some safety to these women because they're in a house, it's run by a madam, there's some degree of protection from the guys that come in, but one of the most important things is these madams are all paying off the police force, so if they do happen to get raided, the worst thing that's going to happen to them is they're going to get a fine. There is no jail time at all ever served by these women working in the red light districts. They again continue to work under a pseudonym, so if they ever want to move or change their profession, they have the ability to do that. By the time the red light district comes, they can actually count the number of brothels. They count them. There were 18 documented brothels in 1903, 3 to 5 women in each. And again, there's only one African American brothel in town. The interesting thing, again, when we were talking about white slavery, a lot of the brothels, especially in the St. Mary's Flats, begin to be run by people who are not Northern European. They're beginning to be run by Eastern or Southern Europeans. This is the first time that you see an influx of Syrian and Lebanese immigrants into Fort Wayne. Interestingly enough, that's also the first time you hear any talk about white slavery. Now, you can't tell me that it didn't exist before then, but this is the first time that people are starting to talk about it. These are the only photographs of known brothels in Fort Wayne that we can find. This is the St. Mary's Flats. The picture closest to me is the front. The picture behind me, and you can't really see it that well, but the next picture is the rear of those. Can you tell where the river flows? I mean, this place, they must have been, I mean, our rivers are not that great and they're not that clean. These things must have flooded, they must have smelled bad. They're throwing all their sewage right off the back porch, right into the river. These places must have been nasty. All right, to follow our history lesson, the next period of time that people start talking about is the Progressive Era. And the Progressive Era runs basically from the late 1800s to about 1920. And people are starting to change their attitudes towards things. They're really starting to get fed up with crime. They realize that their government is pretty corrupt. And the Progressive Era is characterized by people wanting to clean up government, eliminate corruption. One of the reasons they support prohibition is they know that a lot of crime and crime bosses get their money and their power from the sale of alcohol. So that's why prohibition among them becomes so popular. If you get rid of the booze, if you get rid of the saloons, you take the power away from the corruption. And at the same time, they're trying to put an end to prostitution, and they're taking an interest in women's suffrage. All right, these are the really fun stories, I think. So about this period of time, we start seeing some investigation of both police corruption and Syrian Lebanese brothels. Very interesting that the white slavery discussions are not taking place in the Northern European madams' brothels, that they're taking place here. The most infamous madam was accused of white slavery. Her name was Mary Malloly. Mary Malloly was a Syrian woman who owned several of the brothels on the flats, the picture that we just showed you. And it was basically the contention that she would encourage girls to come work in her brothel with all these promises of great clothes, riches, a wonderful lifestyle, yada, yada, yada. And then once they got there, it wasn't at all what she pictured it to be, and there was no way out. What they didn't charge her with, they probably could have convicted her of. She's acquitted of the white slavery charges, but she mostly made her money by then also charging a tribute or a kickback on all the services that were going on in these brothels. So she was getting a percentage of anything in all these places that she owned, and she had the same or similar connection to a lot of businesses in downtown. However, at the same time, our police chief at that time, his name was Elliott, and he is indicted for bribery by the grand jury, and he's actually convicted, and he goes to prison. And I'll tell you, I'm getting to the stories now because they're really fun. As a result of all this, they arrest about 104 business and brothel owners from the flats. All of them are convicted, and on the women, the judge looks at all of them and says, I'm fining you now, but if I ever have you back here again, you're all going to jail. Well, that pretty much spelled the end of the flats. So the flats are pretty much shut down because none of these women want to risk going to prison. So this again I took from Karen Abbott's book, but this is pretty much how it went. This shows a drawing of a young woman who's clearly an immigrant being met by two men who are trying to coerce her into the brothel trade. And again, you know, the stories of what happens are pretty similar. They're taken back to the brothel. The first thing that happens is they get raped, and then once they're raped, you know, the prohibition against marriage is pretty much there. Nobody's going to have them, so that's the only life they're left to then. And that's how a lot of these women end up in brothels. And I think, like I said, in larger cities, this is much more prevalent than it was in Fort Wayne. All right, this is kind of fun. Apparently at the time, the Fort Wayne newspaper was called the Journal-Gazette. I have no idea if it even is the same newspaper. I somewhat doubt it because this is, well, it might have been. This is 1910. Anyway, their editor is a guy by the name of Andrew Moynihan. Now, you know, he must have been a pretty interesting investigative journalist because during the Christmas season, he decides he's going to cruise over to the police department and kind of wander around while nobody's looking. So he starts wandering around and he gets over to Chief Elliott's desk and he finds it piled high with all these gifts, many of which are not wrapped, and several of them consist of diamond pins. And he begins to wonder what's going on with all this. So he does a little investigation and finds out that a lot of these pins are from a jeweler paid for by brothel money from the flats. So these pins are all bribes. Several of them are traced back to that fine lass, Mary Maloney. So, as they get traced back to the brothels, an interesting thing then happens. All of this becomes public record. He's convicted. He goes to prison. What I found really interesting was the Maloney family, and yes, it is the same family that belongs to the grocery store. Mary dies in 1944 at age 63. So, and I'm going to show you, she's just a lovely lass. Yes, she's the large woman in the middle. And that's a picture of her in her carriage over there. So, Mary dies. And her family donates the obituary book to the History Center. And I waltz up to the History Center, and Walter Font, God bless him, brings this out, and we sit there and laugh at this thing together. It is hilarious. So in the beginning is the obituary, and then all the postcards follow, mostly from the Syrian families in town, Bojrab, Bonahum, lots of other names that are not ringing a bell. Those two rang a bell with me. So anyway, so it gives her obituary. So I just want to read a little bit from her obituary. And knowing what we know about Mary, I just think this is a crack-up. She was one of the city's most picturesque persons of a quarter century ago. She also had contact with the seamy side of life. No kidding. In the heyday of her varied business career, including many dealings in realty, she knew all the public officials and many business leaders as well. Her medium of exchange were gold coins or valuable gems, which she kept in a leather pouch with her at all times. She would keep thousands of dollars of choice gemstones in the pouch, always on her person, but she was never afraid of being robbed due to her size. And then she became known as a philanthropist. Well, piecing all that together, Mary must have been bribing a hell of a lot of people. And that's why Mary stayed in business so long. And it would be my guess then that when the flats got closed down, that Mary needed to come into a much more respectable line of work. So anyway, there's Mary Malloy for you, the woman caught bribing the chief of police. Now, we've now reached, and I'm trying to stay on time, about 1920, and brothel prostitution really does diminish in town. They end up leveling the flats, and where the flats were is now basically Headwaters Park. Chicago Street, where the railroad is actually demolished, as are all the slums and the brothels around there. The street disappears completely. So does Eureka Street on the flats. And the red light districts, as we've known them in the past, really begin to disappear. What's left are a few hotels that, where prostitutes work on East Columbia and Calhoun, but East Columbia disappears too, because that becomes the parking garage, Fryman Square, the fire department, follow it all the way down to the river. All of that goes away. What I found really most interesting is the end of prostitution in this town really wasn't because of law enforcement, it wasn't because of what the police were doing, but what really changed prostitution in Fort Wayne and what really caused it to diminish was really the whole change in attitude of the public. The 1920s come, if you're thinking about flappers, you're thinking about a time of really liberated sexuality among people. Our morals are changing. At that point in time, we've now got legalized birth control. Women are getting, and a lot of it, you know, to us, a lot of it is because women are getting the right to vote, and they're finally starting to do things for one another. Women get the right to vote. Citizens get tired of this stuff, but you know, if you can now have a sexual relationship with your wife and you can have a sexual relationship with your girlfriend, the need for a prostitute is really not the same as it was earlier in time. And we begin to accept unwed mothers into society, and we don't ostracize women who have had relationships outside of their marriage. So again, what I found most interesting is this really is what results in the change in the whole way prostitution worked in this city. So I stopped at 1920 because I'm already 10 minutes over, and I knew I would go lots over if I kept on going. But I really appreciate everybody's attendance. Before you go, does anybody have any questions before I give you my the Vice President of Arch's lecture on membership? We really do try to make history fun at Arch. We're trying really hard to preserve what we have left of our history. I would really love it if everyone in this room would pick up a membership brochure. They're only like 20 bucks for an individual and 35 for a family. I'd love it if everybody would pick up one and become a member. We're going to do a whole series of lectures. The next one is on Hanging Rock, right, Lori?
Yes.
We're doing next month on Hanging Rock, which has a lot to do with Native Americans and other fun stuff. So thank you all for coming. Does anybody have any questions? I really had to whack this down to an hour's lecture. Yeah, John?
What about prostitution today?
It's really different. It really is. We still have a lot of it, but it functions in a way, because I try these cases, that's how I know. It functions in a way that's really different. Just like technology has hit everything else, most hookers advertise online. They get various services. One of them was called Backpage, and you just go on to those sites, and as fast as the computer people shut them down, they pop up again. And what makes these women so hard to catch is not only that they're advertising online, but a lot of them are not from here. They'll get on a circuit, and different days they'll do different cities, and you contact them, and then they'll set up 4 or 5 guys, and then they'll come to Fort Wayne, stay at one of the seedy motels out on Coliseum, come do what they do, and then they leave. And that's pretty much what prostitution looks like now, and that's why it's so difficult to regulate, because about the only way you can do it is to send undercover guys in as Johns to make the arrest. What I think is really, to me, troubling is white slavery has, and I wouldn't call it white slavery, we call it human trafficking now, has really become prevalent, especially with Eastern European and Asian women. But the other thing is, you would be amazed at the number of younger girls that you find on these sites. There's a lot of 16, 17-year-old girls that are doing this because, we pretty much okay premarital sex, and at that age, it's not that uncommon. And I think these girls are figuring, hey, if I'm going to do it, I might as well make some money. There's a whole different way that it looks now than it ever looked before. Yeah.
What role did Fort Wayne's churches play in all this prostitution? Did they actively try to fight it, or did you have pastors who were known to frequent these houses?
Yeah, I did not see, I saw one elder in the Presbyterian church that was mentioned got arrested for prostitution, but really, I don't think, no offense, but I don't think the churches helped these women out at all. I think they perpetuated the whole concept that if you had sex out of marriage, you were a fallen woman and you weren't an appropriate person to be in a church. So when Mason Long comes out with his book, one of the reasons he's doing these evangelistic tours is to try to get church people to realize that a lot of these women are really victims of a whole set of societal stuff that's inappropriate, and trying to get churches to reach down and try to help folks. So I didn't find them being helpful at all. I did find one instance where somebody got arrested and it was traced back to his church membership, but nothing seemed to happen to him because, again, if you weren't having sex at home, it was considered okay as long as you did it quietly to go someplace else. It was a really twisted, bizarre way to live life. Anybody else? Yeah.
Me? Yeah. I would, the Mayflower madam that was arrested a few years ago. How prevalent is that? Or is that more big city?
I don't really see that here. I don't really see it organized like a call girl service with a madam like that. And again, the problem is if it's here, it's all done online, and it is so darn hard to find. We've had just one of those, was a lady and her daughter that I think actually worked out of Canterbury Green. So we've had one of those, but it was not nearly on the scale that it is in bigger cities. Yeah.
Karen, just trying to give a theme or to some of what you've given us, it's interesting to me that at a certain period of time, it looks like the city fathers, as it were, kind of accepted the fact that prostitution was going to happen, and as long as it was organized and kind of stabilized in certain geographies, it was going to be okay.
I think that was pretty much the concept, and again,
but that broke down. And I was
it again just seems like at various points in time. I think Franklin Randall was an okay guy. But a lot of the mayors that followed him were just as corrupt as they could be. And I think, the only time that you saw a lot of arrests was when there were a lot of kickbacks going on. So, we didn't tend to be led by folks that seemed to be on the up and up where this stuff was all concerned either. So it was, like I said, it's like that whole, that's how you get vice, is you get people doing something wrong with a corrupt law enforcement system and a corrupt government, and then the stuff just goes wild. And I think that's probably why we had so much of it. And I don't think anybody would have gotten arrested if there wouldn't have been so much drinking going on associated with it. So people were making just blithering fools out of themselves in the middle of the street. Yeah.
This reminded me of something. I've lived downtown for like 45 years, but I first lived in an apartment house on Webster in Maine.
Yeah.
It's not there anymore. But there were two girls that lived on the top floor. They worked out of the Rosemary Hotel, and they specialized in old men.
Yeah.
And they were only like, one was 17, one was 18.
Yeah.
They had money. It was ridiculous.
Yeah, the
And
money
I
those
asked them
women
about
made
what
back
they were
then,
doing.
the good
they-
brothels, you could make good money.
Yeah, they just go down to the Rosemary at night and come home with some I don't know.
Yeah,
It was really strange.
it's an odd business. Anybody else? Thanks a bunch, folks. I hope you appreciate it. Thank you for